Have you ever been called a wet blanket? Did you take that as a compliment? If your mind harkens back to when that term was first used, you may have been a lifesaver. What is the origin of this term, wet blanket? Details straight ahead. Hello and welcome to History of Everyday Sayings. I am your host, Stephen Carter. I thank you for joining me. Who is this show for? If you are a philomath, a logophile, or you're simply someone who loves history tidbits you can share with friends and family, this show is for you. I'll bet you've heard the term wet blanket, perhaps used in a context such as, oh, that person is such a wet blanket. What does the term really mean and where did it come from? Let's begin our investigation at Grammarist.com. That site tells us that the term wet blanket is an idiom with roots in the 1600s. An idiom is a word, a group of words, or a phrase that has a figurative meaning that is not easily deduced from its literal definition. Often using descriptive imagery, common idioms are words and phrases used in the English language in order to convey a concise idea. Idioms are often spoken or are considered informal or conversational. English idioms can illustrate emotions more quickly than a phrase that has a literal meaning, even when the etymology or origin of the idiomatic expression is lost. This site goes on to tell us, quote, a wet blanket is someone who spoils the enjoyment of a situation, someone who dampens other people's joy. The expression dates from around the 1870s and is based on the fact that cooks at that time kept a wet blanket in the kitchen to smother fires quickly. This practice dates back to at least the mid-1600s. It's easy to see the parallel between extinguishing a fire and extinguishing someone's joy. This term is often seen as a verb, as in throwing a wet blanket over a proceeding or an event. Used as a noun, it can accuse someone of being a wet blanket or admonishing someone not to be a wet blanket. If we go to disappearingidioms.com for the term wet blanket, they ask, how would somebody describe a wet blanket? Usually it's a person, although sometimes it can be a thing, such as a philosophy, an organization, or an entire community or environment that can always be counted on to spoil the fun or dampen the enjoyment of others. In other words, a party pooper, a spoilsport, a killjoy, a Debbie Downer, and other derogatory terms. So who can we look to as examples of wet blankets? How about Eeyore? That always pessimistic plush toy donkey who was featured in the Winnie the Pooh children's stories? Back in the heyday of cartoons, we had Sad Sack, an inept, perpetually downcast U.S. Army private appearing in Yank magazine. Interestingly, Private Sad Sack was created during World War II, and that character was created for the amusement of our troops. And on this site, we are also told the beginning of the expression wet blanket goes back to at least the 1660s. According to the online etymology dictionary, when it referred to a simple way to fight small fires. The solution? Keep a thoroughly wetted blanket handy as a way to smother a sudden flare-up, especially in confined places. By the 1800s, the term wet blanket had pretty much taken on the meaning that we understand it today in Godey's Ladies' Book and Magazine from February 1871, we have a quote, "Wet blankets. Why could they not let us enjoy ourselves in our own way?" Which was not a way that interfered with any other person's, that trod on no one's toes, shouldered no one out of place, and did not earthly damage to friend or foe. All we asked for was leave to nurse our own small fire by our own hearthstone, leave to laugh, to sing, to feel hopeful and joyous, when down fell the wet blanket, and extinguished every spark and every flame, leaving us as cheerless, cold, and melancholy as before we had been bright. This American monthly magazine had a circulation of over 150,000, so quite a lot of people apparently got the word as to what a wet blanket was all about. For our final reference, we go to phrases.org.uk. What is the meaning of the phrase wet blanket? A person or thing that says or does something to impinge on other people's enjoyment. So what's the origin? Well, phrases.org tells us, quote, "A wet blanket is an excellent means of smothering a fire. Being both heavy, flexible, and wet, it cools the flammable material and molds itself around it to exclude fire." There are many examples in print of this literal usage of wet blankets. The term began being used in a figurative sense in the late 18th century. A report of the French invasion of Switzerland in the English newspaper The Kentish Gazette, December 1798, includes a story where a wet blanket is used to douse a figurative fire. Quote, "There was no man so besotted as to not believe that the Swiss would heartily join the cause, if a general confederacy was formed on the continent, but if this motion were to be adopted, we should throw a wet blanket on the fire, which was otherwise about to spread through Europe." In another report of the same conflict, in the same month, the Hampshire Chronicle uses wet blanket in its current dampening the spirit sense. Quote, "Could the fathers, brothers, and husbands of the wretched females, victims of lust and cruelty, be dead to all feeling? Can the inhabitants of Stotts forget the destruction of their city? Would they by vote throw a wet blanket upon their rising spirit?" Close quote. Wet blanket has moved over time from being a simile to be a proper metaphor. So if you choose to be a wet blanket that puts out unwanted fires rather than a wet blanket that dampens the spirit and the joy of other people. If you have not yet subscribed or you're not following History of Everyday Sayings, I encourage you to do that where you get your podcasts. You can find previous episodes of this podcast and others on our website, stressreliefradio.com, stressreliefradio.com. If you would like to reach me for any reason, email me at cartermethod@gmail.com, cartermethod@gmail.com. Until our next visit together, your host here, Stephen Carter, and I wish for you and your loved ones blessings in abundance.